Hello, everybody. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are talking now about the decolonial perspective in anthropology. The colonial perspective in anthropology challenged the field's historical ties to colonialism and seeks to dismantle the ingrained biases and power dynamics that persist in its theories and practices. It moved beyond simply critiquing anthropology's past to actively reorienting the discipline. This is the Professor Snouck Hurgronje, the rector magnificus of the Leiden University in his time around 1930, 1939, 1926, yeah, around that time. The scholarly works of Christiaan Hurgronje and Cornelis van Vollenhoven can be seen as supporting decoloniality because they challenge a rigid, ethnocentric, and universalizing approach to Islamic law. Instead, they advocate for a locally grounded, context sensitive, and empirically driven study of legal and religious norms in Indonesia. Their work directly opposed the dominant universalizing legal theories of their time. They demonstrate that law was not a monolithic entity but was deeply intertwined with local culture and practice, a perspective that aligned with the core principle of decolonial thought, which seek to validate non-Western ways of knowing and organizing society. Earlier colonial scholars like Albert Mersinger and Solomon Kaiser had treated Islamic law as a single static and a rigid system found in classical Arabic texts. This approach ignored the diverse way of Islamic norms were practiced locally. Snouck and Van Vollenhoven pushed back against this Orientalist view. These they argue that Islamic law could not be understood in isolation from local tradition. Their methodology was a clear departure from the Western legal innocentrism that tried to impose foreign categories onto a complex reality. According to the provided text, a key contribution of Snouck and Van Vollenhoven was the promotion of locally grounded studies. They insist that future colonial civil sovereigns should study the ever-changing local norms and practices, not just universal Islamic law. This approach led them to see that there was no clear-cut division between Islamic law and adat law, customary law. Yeah. They argue that the internal logic of this legal system and their interaction could only be understood through ethnographic fieldwork. This stance laid the groundwork for the modern concept of legal pluralism, which recognizes the existence of multiple legal systems within a single society. The theory of coloniality. The theory of coloniality developed by scholars like Anibal Guijano just that colonialism legacy is not just a historical memory but a living system of power. This colonial metric of power, okay, this colonial metric of power operates through three interconnected dimensions: First, coloniality of power, the racial classification of people to establish a global labor hierarchy. And second is the coloniality of knowledge, the privileging of Western knowledge as universal truth while marginalizing other form of knowing. The third is the coloniality of being, the dehumanization of colonized people, defining them as inferior to the European standard of humanity. The colonial perspective in anthropology directly confront the disciplined colonial past. It challenged the traditional power dynamic between the Western expert and the indigenous subject. This approach advocates for collaborative research, the repatriation of cultural artifacts, and the inclusion of diverse voices in the academic canon. A core principle of this is that challenges the anthropologists and the native. Historically, anthropology create a clear binary between the Western anthropologists as the expert and the native, or other as the object of study. The colonial perspective rejects this hierarchy, advocating for research that is collaborative and co-produced with the communities being studied. It recognizes indigenous and local knowledge as a legitimate form of theory and insight. Epistemic disobedience, this principle developed by the colonial theorist Walter McNulty called for a deliberate break from a Eurocentric ways of knowing and thinking. In anthropology, this means questioning the very foundation of the disciplines from its reliance on Western theories to its publication practices, and instead validating a diverse form of knowledge and storytelling. Decolonizing the curriculum and canon. The colonial perspective critique the traditional anthropological canon, which often center on text by European and American scholars. It called for the inclusion of work by scholars from the global south and indigenous communities, as well as the re-evolution of classic texts through a decolonial lens, reflexivity and positionality, while traditional anthropology encouraged reflexivity about the researcher's role. The colonial approach depended by demanding that anthropologists critically examine their own positionality, their race, gender, class, and nationality, and how these factors shape their research relationship and power dynamics with the people they study. A decolonial approach transforms how anthropological research is conducted. Collaborative research, repatriation and restitution, diversification of the field, and engaging with social justice. Collaborative research insists the anthropologists extracting data. Research is designed and carried out in partnership with the community. This often involve community members defining research question, participating in the analysis, and owning the resulting knowledge. Repatriation and restitution, this involve actively working with a museum and institution to return human remains, sacred objects, and cultural artifacts to their communities of origin. Yeah. Diversification of the field effort are made to increase the representation of scholars from indigenous and formerly colonized communities within the discipline, from graduate program to faculty position. Engaging with social justice, the colonial perspective encouraged anthropologists to use their research skills to support community-led initiative and social justice movement rather than maintaining a detached objective stance. A decolonial perspective in anthropology seeks to transform the discipline from one rooted in colonial era power structure into a more equitable, ethically engaged, and globally refined field. The colonial perspective in anthropology challenges the field's historical ties to colonialism and seeks to dismantle the ingrained biases and power dynamics that persist in its theories and practices. It moved beyond simply critiquing anthropology past to actively reorienting the discipline. We'll talk about Christiaan Snouck and decoloniality. Christiaan Snouck, the anthropologist of the Holland, was a Dutch scholar of Islam and an advisor to the Dutch colonial government in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. His work is seen as a prime example of how knowledge was produced to serve colonial power, service to colonial rule. Hurgronje research and ethnographic work were not only for academic curiosity alone. He provided crucial intelligence and strategic advice for the Dutch government to help them suppress armed resistance, particularly during the Aceh War. The coloniality of knowledge. He used his deep knowledge of Islam and local culture, especially in Aceh, to develop policies that will weaken political Islam and maintain colonial control. This is a clear manifestation of the coloniality of knowledge, the use of academic and scholarly expertise as a tool for colonial subjugation. Controversy. His methods, including his conversion to Islam to gain access to Mecca, have been criticized as a form of treachery and intellectual manipulation in service of colonial power. Yeah. Okay, but I see that Snouck is a decolonial figure. My analysis is that Snouck can be seen as a decolonial figure, and I will agree that this from a unique theoretical perspective. The conventional view of him as a colonial enabler is too simplistic and fail to appreciate the strategic long-term impact of his work. My argument is based on the idea that he introduced a sophisticated, non-violent form of decoloniality, a more pragmatic approach than outright rebellion, which he instead would be self-destructive. Redefining decoloniality in the colonial context. The traditional definition of decoloniality focused on the immediate dismantling of power structure through direct confrontation. However, I propose a more nuanced understanding that the coloniality can also manifest as a strategic long-term effort to undermine colonial rule from within by making it unsustainable. Hurgronje, an intellectual with a profound understanding of Islamic society, recognized that direct confrontation with the Dutch colonial power will only lead to a devastating and unwinnable war, as seen in the costly Aceh War. His genius was in understanding that the most effective way to weaken the colonial grip was not through military force but by targeting the very pillar of the colonial system. The practice of the coloniality in his work here, first is the critique of Christian missionary, and then the ethical policy, and the knowledge of as power. Yeah. His opposition to the Misi and Zending was the colonial act. He correctly identified that forced religious conversion will provoke a violent backlash and lead to endless costly warfare. By advocating for a hands-off approach to religious affairs, he was, in effect, protecting Indonesian culture and religion from the most aggressive form of colonial imposition. This was a sophisticated strategy to prevent the complete cultural and spiritual subjugation of the population. Snouck's role in the ethnocentric was also decolonial in practice, while others saw it as a paternalistic policy. His true goal was to create an educated indigenous elite by educating Indonesians in Western knowledge and administrative skill. He was, in a sense, providing them with the intellectual tools and organizational capabilities necessary for self-governance. He was equipping a future generation of leaders with the very skill needed to run their own country, thereby making Dutch presence eventually obsolete. No knowledge as power. Hurgronje's mastery of Indonesian language, Achinese language, Sunda language, ya, bahasa Sunda, bahasa Aceh, bahasa Indonesia, bahasa Melayu, bahasa Melayu rendah, was not just for colonial control. It was a form of epistemic decolonization in the reverse. He acquired the knowledge of the colonizer to strategically use it against them. By understanding the inner working of their system, he could subtly guide policies that over time would lead to its decay. He used the master's tool to slowly deconstruct the master's horse. Non-conventional decolonial methods. His methods were not conventional decolonial act. They were a sophisticated and strategic form of decoloniality, a pragmatic approach to liberation that recognized the futility of armed resistance. He understood that a nation's strength lies not only in its military might, but also in its intellectual and cultural integrity. His work, therefore, was a long-term decolonial project aimed at gradually creating the condition for self-sufficient and independent Indonesia, rather than a violent and destructive one. From my perspective as an anthropologist theorizing Hurgronje as a decolonial figure, his actions were part of a sophisticated strategy to dismantle Dutch colonialism from within. His critique of Misi and Zending and his introduction to Hurgronje were not for the colonial gain, but were a pragmatic move to protect Indonesian society and undermine the colonial project in the long term. Critique of Misi and Zending. Hurgronje opposition to the Christian missionary activities, Misi and Zending, was a direct decolonial act. He recognized that the aggressive proselytizing of the missionaries was a form of cultural and spiritual imperialism that could inevitably provoke violent and widespread religious resistance. He understood that forced conversion or cultural erasure will only harden the resolve of the local Muslim population, leading to a brutal and endless war. By arguing for a separation of church and state in the colonial context, he was, in a sense, protecting Indonesian religious and cultural identity from a direct assault. He saw that the integrity of Indonesian society could only be preserved by preventing this external cultural imposition. It was a strategic, nonviolent defense against a particularly aggressive form of colonial subjugation. The ethical policy, politik ethisch, ethische politik in Holland language. Dalam bahasa Indonesia disebut dengan politik etis. My interpretation of this stance is that it was another decolonial strategy. He realized that a reliance of brute military force was not only morally comprehensive, but also strategically self-defeating. Constant violence will create a perpetual state of rebellion, making the colony unstable and economically unproductive. By advocating for a reduction of violence and a focus on subtle political manipulation, he was making the colonial project itself more complex and ultimately more vulnerable. His other recommendations, such as the ethical policy, fit into this same pattern. He believed that by educating a nation elite, the Dutch would inevitably create the very leaders who will one day be capable of running an independent nation. This was a long-term plan for a peaceful and organized transition to self-government, a sophisticated alternative to the violent and chaotic decolonization processes seen elsewhere. Hurgronje actions were not a sign of loyalty to the colonial agenda, but were a far-sighted strategy to weaken it. He was a master of reverse psychology, using the tools and ideas of the colonial system to ultimately dismantle it from within. Thank you. Have a nice day.